This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of decision makers and general audience interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that. Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I'm so pleased to welcome Sheeva Azma to the show today. A science communicator and strategist, Sheeva is the founder of Fancy Comma LLC, a digital and strategic communications company that serves clients in healthcare, finance, public policy, and science and technology, among other industries. As part of her communication expertise, Sheeva also has journalism experience. Her byline work has appeared in places like The Motley Fool, the Union of Concerned Scientists blog, and many other places. Prior to founding her communication firm, Sheeva spent a decade in neuroscience research at MIT, Harvard Medical School, and Georgetown University. She also has spent time in the public policy world with internships in the U.S. House of Representatives and also at a Washington, D.C. think tank. Sheeva earned her bachelor's from MIT in brain and cognitive sciences and master's in neuroscience from Georgetown University. Welcome to the show, Sheeva. I am so happy you are here.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to talk about science communications and science policy.
So, Sheeva, you've had longstanding experience in both science and public policy, as described in the intro. Many listeners with science backgrounds are interested in policymaking, but they may not know exactly how to get involved. So, as a scientist and policy person, can you share your story from being a research assistant in neuroscience to a legislative intern in the United States Congress?
Yes, yeah, it's a relatively rare path, but I think that if more scientists knew that they could work in policy, they would want to follow in my footsteps. There are some channels for scientists to get involved in policy, but I never really managed to get into policy through those channels, so I just did it myself. As I mentioned, I tried like the internships in college. The AAAS fellowship requires you to have a PhD, which I was in a PhD program, but never ended up getting my PhD. So I actually got into grad school just to do something like that and as a scientist. But I really think that every scientist who wants to be able to do science policy or do public policy should be able to pursue a public policy career. So how did I get there from being a research assistant to working in Congress as a legislative intern? The answer is I have always been interested in policy. Like one of my first memories, I was in a cab with my parents. I was like 6 years old, and it was like the Michael Dukakis versus George Bush race. And I was like yelling about Michael Dukakis in the back of the cab. I was like, Michael Dukakis. And then the cab driver looked at us like, okay, that's really weird. And I like grew up watching C-SPAN and got an existential crisis when the government shut down in the Clinton years when I was in middle school. I went to MIT. I did parliamentary debate on the same debate circuit as Ted Cruz and a bunch of people who are now Supreme Court clerks and high-powered lawyers. I applied to work on the House Science and Space Committee, but I didn't get a response back. And actually, I had this really weird error where I like submitted the form and then it was like the form didn't get submitted or it came back with some weird error. Back in the late 2000s or early 2000s, the internet was a lot different. And so I don't even know if that really got submit. I was in college when 9/11 happened. I watched a lot of C-SPAN. There was so many filibusters back then. They were super entertaining. One day I didn't have too much work, so I hopped over to Harvard Institute of Politics and I went to the session where I met Representative Mike Capuano, who got unseated by Ayanna Pressley. I've also worked on local, state, and federal political campaigns in Massachusetts and Oklahoma since high school, filmmaking for Robert Reich, who ran against Mitt Romney unsuccessfully, as well as other local candidates, such as a Republican state candidate named Dara Pourghasemi, who won his primary but lost the general. I also worked on Brad Carson's Senate campaign here in Oklahoma in 2004. He won the primary but narrowly lost the general election to Tom Coburn. And I just read this on Wikipedia yesterday that election analysts have called the Carson campaign one of the best run campaigns in the nation. So even though I was a scientist, a science person, I was apparently doing the most in policy. After I graduated from MIT, I decided I wanted to go to grad school for neuroscience because everyone was using functional magnetic resonance brain imaging, or fMRI, which was a new technology at the time. It had only been invented for about a decade when I was in college. So I worked at the birthplace of fMRI, which was Massachusetts General Hospital, and I studied the effects of alcohol in the brain, both in alcoholism and also literally, we made screwdrivers for people. We made them screwdrivers, we waited a bit, and then we just put them in the scanner and saw what their brain did as they did different tasks. Our research was actually really relevant to policy, and as our PI noted, we could have applied that research to make new laws about drunk driving based on what we know about the brain. So I was really into brain imaging at that time, so I applied to grad school, got into several programs. But I chose to attend Georgetown because it was in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to do science policy. And I did a lot of science policy. I interned at the Potomac Institute studying cognitive enhancement and defense applications of neuroscience. I was also a Society for Neuroscience early career policy fellow, which meant that I went to Capitol Hill to my personal constituents and tried to talk to them about why they should support federal science funding, which actually, even though my representatives as an Oklahoman are like really Republican, it turns out they're actually incredibly pro-science. I went to Senator Mike Lee's office, who was a new guy at the time, and I ate Jell-O in their office, and I talked to their staffers about science funding. And that actually taught me a lot about bipartisanship and working collaboratively. Science is almost entirely federally funded, so it's important to make these connections with your lawmakers. I also did research in graduate school, but grad school didn't go the way I expected. I worked on two really interesting projects studying PTSD and adolescent brain development in the context of addiction and decision making. But in the high levels of science, graduate students, like in our whisper networks, we'd always be like, oh, don't talk about doing anything besides academic science, because your advisor is going to be like, what's the point of doing that? One day I casually mentioned to my advisor that I was interested in science policy and communications, and he said that I could do that without a PhD. So I got my master's degree, which actually is unique to Georgetown, because in most programs you might leave with no degree. When I left graduate school with my master's, I immediately went home and joined a freelancing website called Elance. Now it's called Upwork. I also was applying to federal government jobs at places like the National Science Foundation. I was doing science writing for my clients on the side. I published an academic science policy article about using MRI to study the effects of poverty on the brain at the Potomac Institute, where I had interned in graduate school. But living in Washington was too expensive, and I wasn't sure what I was doing with my life after getting my master's, so I just moved to Oklahoma. Then I got really policy sick, just started to miss like the DC policy world, which is like very fast-paced, exciting. There's always important stuff happening. Not so much at my parents' house. So I reached out to Senator Warren's office, since I lived in Massachusetts for a while, and then I got some advice from them. And I actually applied for jobs. I got an offer from Representative Westerman's office, who's a right-wing guy in Arkansas, but I didn't have money to move to Washington. Then a couple months later, in late 2016, I got an offer to work in Representative Delaney's office. He's a moderate Democrat who served on the finance committee, and I accepted the job. I packed up my belongings in a rental car, then I drove to Washington and was a legislative intern for about 2.5 months in the beginning of the Trump administration. Among my first tasks as a red state Democrat working on the Hill was writing a welcome email for people coming to our office to pick up inauguration tickets. It was a really exciting and fun time to work in Congress. And unfortunately, I basically lived in a hotel because I didn't have time. I didn't know that once you become an intern, it's like science where like you have these long blocks of time, you're just doing all this important stuff, important maybe to other people. Some of the stuff I did, I was like, anyone can sort mail or whatever, but truly important for like your constituents. I didn't have time to find housing, and I didn't have money for the deposit, so I ended up living in a hotel for 2.5 months.
Oh.
And I racked up $13,000 in credit card debt. And that's part of the reason I got into freelancing after that, was because I had to start paying my debts. But that's why I don't really recommend my path for people interested in science policy, but it wasn't really an intentional path, but rather a path I created for myself to merge all of my interests. I never thought as a scientist I could work on Capitol Hill, but I did. And now I'm doing all of this really interesting stuff related to policy. Like I did some policy analysis on US-China trade policy for Connell Wise and Associates, which is a DC-based firm. kind of like a think tank. And now I've written some white papers to be read by Congress on technology issues, different reforms. It's been really cool. I don't think that my path is necessarily what I saw for myself working in Congress, because even as a scientist, I'm creating a new path for myself, and I'm excited about the combination of science, communications, and policy that I've carved out in my work.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's so fascinating to me because it sounds like you, from a very young age, were dialed in to politics before maybe you were thinking about being a scientist. And then as you continued to cultivate that interest and pick up various policy experiences, even throughout your scientific career within academia. And as you talked about the research that you were doing with respect to fMRI, and like you noted, a lot of implications for public policy, the topics that you're looking at, the effect of poverty on the brain. It's a fascinating and such an important topic. And as well, the one that you were talking about regarding alcohol and the effect on the ability to do certain tasks. Definitely that information should be informing policymaking. So I just think that's really cool. And like you said, it was almost like force of will that you decided it was your passion and you were going to figure out a way to follow it. And you've come to a spot where you're now influencing policy from the outside through the white papers that you described, for example. I would love for you to talk about what maybe surprised you or was unexpected as you move from the world of science to a policymaking environment. Are there, in your view, common misperceptions that you may have encountered among your science colleagues about what it's actually like to work in Congress, for example? A lot of people think, oh, it'd be really cool to work in Congress or work in policy on some either government level or for a think tank, which you've also done. But people in the research community, scientists, students, for example, may not have a really good fix on what that really means because they haven't been on the inside as you have. So could you share with us some of the things that maybe surprised you or were unexpected, or maybe address some misperceptions that you've encountered in talking with other scientists?
Yeah, first I have to say that there's no one more plugged into politics than scientists, but not in the way that you would expect. Like, I would be in lab meeting. I lived in two very coastal elite cities, Boston and Washington.
Mhm.
They're very Democrat and very progressive cities. In lab meeting, you would definitely just chat about what the latest right winger is doing in Congress. It's not that scientists aren't plugged into policy. It's just that I would listen to my colleagues complain when you're a Democrat, like, Republican does something, you're like, no, did not like that. Or there's no science funding. Like, it's because the right, I don't remember what the reason was that we would always complain that there was no science funding. There never was any science funding for several years. And I was really surprised there were not that many scientists involved in policy making. I never really got the impression that we were calling our congressmen
Mm.
to get them to increase science funding. I felt like we were just complaining about it in lab. Who knows? Maybe some people actually were contacting their Congress members, but I think part of the reason is that the science world and the policy world are just completely different. Like in biomedical science, we wear jeans to lab, we want to cure cancer and stuff like that. And the goal is to be rigorous scientifically, testing hypotheses, presenting cool new discoveries. But in Congress, that's not how Congress works. There's a specific mode of communication that policymakers do. The scientists, I think, don't really get training in. I personally did a lot of other stuff, like I worked on political campaigns. I called my congressman. MIT just sent me an email because I'm an alumni of there, and they were like, contact your congressman about the CHIPS Act. And so I just contacted them the other day, and I'm not sure how many scientists do that. These days, it seems like a lot of scientists are like much more engaged in the policy world.
Let me ask you about that, actually, Sheeva, if I could. Why do you think there's more activism? A lot of things you talked about as far as what you saw with colleagues was maybe like as an observer reading the news and reacting to media coverage of, say, the candidates and what was happening in the primaries. But you have an insider's experience as well, having been legislative intern and actually seeing how the machinery works on the inside, which can be very different from how an observer sees things. And you've noted just now that you feel more scientists are actively getting involved in policy. And it would be great to get your perspective on why you think that is.
I think the main reason is because of science funding, because federal science funding is the main way that we get money in biomedical science. The NIH gets funding from the appropriations every year. And so if there's not enough science funding, then there's no science happening. Or
Right.
so I'm not sure if it's that or if it's that, especially in neuroscience, the way that your brain works. Tom Daschle called neuroscience the final frontier of like humanity. So there's definitely like a lot of interest in, especially neuroscience, maybe like physics, these like areas that have a lot of application to
Mm.
daily life. Because if you understand how your brain works, or maybe ways that the brain is dysfunctional or something that could influence policy. I think that some of the reason too is these programs that have been created to get scientists into policy, like the SFN Early Career Fellows Program. It now has a different name, but it was founded when I was in graduate school. And there's been so many people that were able to go to Capitol Hill and meet their members of Congress and advocate for science funding. The AAAS fellowships are also like
Sure.
another place that a lot of my friends have done those. And I really wanted to do one of those, but I never got my PhD, so I didn't do that. But I think I would love to advise a member of Congress on science at some point
Yeah.
in the Congress. But I think it's a combination of scientists getting wise about politics, everyone becoming more politically engaged, and these programs, the structured programs that are creating a pipeline for scientists to engage with policymakers.
Great. Yes, thank you for that. Now, I want to ask you about this because you're a professional and published communicator. And in addition, during a prior chapter in your career journey, you were a professional scientist. And I found in the course of the podcast and the years that I've been hosting it that individuals typically have a highly developed skill set in just one of these areas, not both, although both skill sets can be learned and sharpened, I strongly believe. But you seem like you came pre-wired with this ability to both be a strong communicator and a strong scientist. And the 6-year-old in the back of the cab talking about, first of all, the fact you could pronounce Dukakis as a 6-year-old is very impressive. You may know that when he was governor in Massachusetts, one of his most famous ads was common mispronunciations of his last name, which was hysterical and a very effective ad. So you were paying attention to politics. You were very verbal. In addition, you were doing cutting edge scientific research. So I'm wondering, was there an aspect from your environment growing up, for example, that fostered your strength in both of these categories, or something else that you could point to that has enabled you to be both an effective and professional communicator, as well as someone who has done some really cool science?
Well, first of all, thank you for that compliment that I'm a scientist and a communicator. And also, that's a cool add-up. I was literally obsessed with Michael Dukakis. I have no idea why. I think I was in some part like already a Massachusetts resident, and that's why I went there for MIT. I have no idea. I just remember being I think I grew up super Democrat, just like a Democrat person. But I actually really struggle with portraying myself because you're right. Most people are either like communications or they're in science. It's really rare to meet someone that's advanced, that has worked on science as much as me, and that has also worked in communications. I recently discovered a PR group created by an MIT educated neuroscientist that has a PhD in neuroscience called Stellate Communications. I finally met or I've encountered someone on LinkedIn that is doing this kind of work, but it's so rare to meet someone that has done science and has also done communications. But that's really why my freelance clients hire me. Like I recently worked with a COVID vaccine manufacturer and they were like, oh, we like that you're a scientist and you also have this communications experience because you can work in both areas. The answer to how I became both of those things is that I've always been interested in science and writing and policy. I was in honors English when I was in high school, won a national award for my writing. I published my high school thesis about E. Cummings, also of Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a literary journal. And I was also my high school graduation speaker. I was an overachiever and I had so many interests, but I didn't even consider myself to be a scientist. It was really surprising to me when I got into MIT, though. I was a total nerd, like in the marching band, academic team, like doing calculus. I grew up watching brain surgeries on the Learning Channel, and I was telling everyone I wanted to be a brain surgeon. The other day I realized with non-invasive brain imaging, I achieved that also. I have these different passions. I end up doing all of these things, and everyone that knows me knows that I love writing, I love science, especially neuroscience and politics, and I honestly think that there are actually a lot of people out there like me, but there are no natural paths to combine science and communication and to consider the impact in other areas like policy on a widespread scale. So I think what really made the difference for me was that I was able to independently pursue these different interests that I had since childhood. And I think everyone in science should be able to access the communications and policy worlds, especially policy, because it doesn't make sense, especially after the pandemic and with environmental sustainability or climate change, whatever you want to call it, semiconductors, like all of that stuff involves science. And I think it's hard to give that just to force policymakers that studied political science to make decisions about that, because scientists can definitely help make better policies that achieve more, that are more effective. Like I know two MIT graduates that are in Congress right now. Alex Padilla of California is serving in the Senate, and Thomas Massey is a kind of like very conservative Republican
Kentucky, right?
from Kentucky. And both of them are incredibly pro-science. Their political views could not be more different, but every time I see either of them talk on science, I'm happy because I know they're just saying something that is at least based in science. So yeah, I think everyone, all MIT graduates or all science people with science background should be working. If they want to work in policy, they should be able to work in policy. I don't know.
Have access to that. Yeah, for sure. And I know it can be a challenge when you're a researcher and you're focused on what's happening in the lab, for example, or if you're a social scientist and you're poring over primary source materials in various places. I want to now ask you about Fancy Comma LLC, which you founded in 2020. It's your own digital and strategic communications company. I know listeners would be interested to discover more about your company and what you've been working on these days. You mentioned this project for a drug manufacturer with respect to COVID vaccine, and I think that's really interesting. Can you tell us more about your company and your work?
Yeah, I've been freelancing since 2013, and then I decided to form a company. So I founded Fancy Comma LLC just 3 weeks before COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. The pandemic was terrible, but being a science writer in the pandemic was amazing because it was hard as a person with a science background. I live in Oklahoma, which we actually passed state laws banning vaccine mandates, banning masks. No one wanted to get a COVID vaccine. Constituents became really engaged. It's not called lobbying when you do it as a personal citizen, but they just called our governor, they called our state legislature. We're like, we don't want this stuff forced on us, and we're going to vote you out if you force this on us. So literally, we passed this anti-science legislation just because that's what the people wanted. So that was heartbreaking to me as a science communicator. Because there was a lot of stuff missing from the discourse on COVID vaccines and hand washing, social distancing. People got so tired of it. That was hard to watch. But the bright spot, if you can say there was a bright spot in all of this, was that I could what I'm really like passionate about, which is communicating science. So I worked for several clients, like I worked for Johnson and Johnson. I worked for another major COVID-19 manufacturer, basically like writing tweets and explaining the science, kind of doing like a science comm strategy for them. And as a major COVID vaccine manufacturer, they're like incredibly busy. So it's like really hard for them to stay on top of everything. But I think they finally started a new communications campaign to boost education of mRNA vaccines. That has been really rewarding because a lot of the hard part about COVID vaccines was that people didn't understand mRNA technology. They thought it changed your DNA, or some people thought it had 5G. I've like literally heard the craziest stuff ever on Twitter about COVID vaccines, and I've answered phones in Congress, and I thought that was the craziest stuff ever. As a science communicator, you just want to come up with a series of explainers for like every single tweet you see that is this kind of fear-based anti-science, I guess you would call it vaccine hesitancy, because it's really normal to have a skepticism of new things, especially if people aren't explaining them to you in a way that really resonates with you or makes sense to you. That has been incredible. And one of the reasons I got hired to work on that was because of my experience as a scientist and also in communication. So I've spent all this time feeling so weird, just working at the fringe of both science and communications. And that was actually what we needed. So maybe we need more people like me out there doing this stuff. Yeah. And that's now what I'm trying to do with Fancy Comma, is trying to figure out how can I get more people that are scientists into science communications. And that's what I've been working on these days. I just published a book to that effect, trying to help scientists that are trying to get into science communications, because everyone's doing science communications these days, but a lot of people are intimidated by science communications. So I'm trying to just rally people around science communications that are in science because I feel like those are the best people to explain science. And if you look at the journalists that won awards for their science writing in the pandemic, people like Ed Yong and
Hmm.
Catherine Wu, they both
Hmm.
have science background. They won the Pulitzer Prize, or Ed Yong won the Pulitzer
Hmm.
Prize. The New York Times won the Pulitzer Prize as well, and Catherine Wu's on staff there. Scientists make the best science communicators, in my opinion, but the opportunities are really hard to come by for scientists because as a scientist, you're expected to do science, and science communications isn't thought of as part of science, but I personally think and know that it makes science better and it makes the world better too. If scientists can explain what they do, if they work on a very small kinase or something, or like whatever they work on, no one's going to know what a kinase is. But if you can explain that in a way that makes sense to people, you can not only explain what you do at family, like Christmas dinner, you can also explain it to advocacy organizations. If you work with diseases, you can maybe get some grants from different places, link up with other people that are not in neuroscience or in your specific field. So there's a lot of benefit to doing this kind of public facing science communication.
Yes, absolutely. And that's where my focus is too. You mentioned your book, Amplifying Science Communication with Public Relations, recently published, and we'll have a link in the show notes that accompany the episode so listeners can learn more about the book, buy the book. And you talked a bit about what motivated you to write it. What are the major themes that you want your readers to take away from the book?
The main theme that I want readers to take away from this book is that if you learn public relations strategies, you can communicate your science more broadly, you can have a greater impact, you can build trust with people, which I've heard different things like the pandemic made people love science, but I've also, living in Oklahoma, I feel like that kind of also worked the other way. Seen so many people, like I saw this guy on Instagram. He went to the ICU for COVID. He like refused to get a COVID vaccine. Then he got out. He still was against COVID vaccines. So stuff like that just makes me so sad. And I think it's because scientists, like in the pandemic, I'd find a scientist tweeting about, sometimes in the pandemic, I'd find a scientist tweeting about something like really like just hot fire tweet, but no one was retweeting them. And then this journalist from The Economist was like, oh, here's the signs of COVID. And it was like wrong. And so obviously it should be the other way around. Like the scientists, their voice should go viral because they're saying like actual science. Like this journalist person, no offense to them, but they didn't get the details, which is like a huge problem in
Mhm.
science journalism. That's what motivated me to write my book, because if scientists had like the bare bones communication strategy that they could get from learning public relations strategies, they can not only get their work out there, like that will help advance their work and it will help advance science. It will build public trust and develop important professional relationships like with stakeholders, lawmakers, other scientists, advocacy groups, and anyone else. So that's the main impetus. Like, I feel like as scientists, we should start thinking about ways to prevent another pandemic through communications, because communications, as everyone in policy knows, like the ground game is so important to elect people. And there wasn't really like a ground game for COVID vaccines, but it was from scientists, and scientists don't get trained in communications. So I think that's actually a huge problem for science. And that's what my book tries to get at. And it provides strategies for science communicators to use public relations to amplify their work.
Wonderful. And like I said, we're going to make it easy for listeners to find that book by putting a link in the show notes. As we wrap up, Sheeva, for a long time, there was, and in some quarters there still is, a denigration of the importance of science communication. As a scientist and a seasoned professional communicator, obviously you appreciate and practice science communication. Can you comment on the dynamic, this dynamic I've just described, like a devaluing of science communication within academia, within academic science, for example? And as you look at science communication's place in academia now, what you think the future might hold for how it's viewed and valued among scientists moving forward?
Yeah. So, first of all, that's a great question. Science communication, when I was in graduate school, was not a thing. Like, if you wanted to do science communication, it was usually like outreach. And outreach is a very small portion of NSF, National Science Foundation grants. I think I once got like honorable mention for the National Science Foundation graduate fellowship program just from my outreach, because they were like, oh, I was doing a lot of outreach because I used to do brain dissections with like high schoolers and teach courses and stuff and communicate science to young people interested in science. Because if you like, you got to start kids young with learning
Mhm.
science so that because it's important for like competitiveness for the US and like to face all these technical challenges. But now I think science communication actually has like this weird place where it's accepted, but it's still not like that accepted. And a lot of graduate students are seeking it out and doing it themselves. When I was in graduate school, like we were literally like, we are just going to say we want to be academic scientists. We're not going to say we want to do, well, we didn't even have science communication as a thing, because it would just be like writing about your work for some sixth graders or something. But we would always, like, if we're doing something that was like tangential to science, we would just keep it on the down low. We wouldn't tell our advisors. I spent a whole semester like hiding my policy internship from my graduate school advisor, literally getting on the subway, like changing my shoes,
My God.
going to the bathroom and changing my clothes and stuff. I think that things have gotten better now. My advisor was really supportive. Like, he wrote me a recommendation for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, and I actually got to interview there a couple times, but didn't get that. But my advisor actually did support it, but it's not like a part of science, like, especially in the upper echelons of science, like at MIT, Georgetown, still good, but MIT is the best. Like, you don't talk about like doing science communication. You're like, I'm going to be an academic scientist, because when your advisor asks you, what do you want to do with your life? Like, obviously it has to be something like incredibly scientific, and communications isn't really considered part of. Someone just posted on Twitter, like, science communication has become, I'm so intimidated by it. It's become so cliquey. And I was like, what do you mean by that? I'm really intimidated because it seems like a lot of people do it and they're cliques about it, and I just have no idea where to start. And so I think it still is something that scientists have to seek out, which is too bad, because there's so many reasons that science communication should be taught in graduate science programs, because all scientists do day and night is write grants to people that are not experts in their work. That would help a lot if they could just explain like what this this little thing they're studying is, like, in layman's terms, like what it is. Like, it's hard to understand, and that takes a lot of thinking, and it takes a lot of work and refining. It's stuff like that, like, starts with explaining your research to your parents, your friends and family, non-scientists. Like, you don't have to formally take a class on it. It would be great if the science communicators did have a resource, like even a 1 or 2 day seminar on communicating science to the public. So it seems like over the past 10 years since I have been in comms, and although I am actually writing up my research on PTSD and soon to be adolescent brain development and alcohol use disorder, I'm going to publish those as a review so that I can say, like, I'm a published scientist, even though I basically left academic science. I'm still in that world, especially now that I've done all this writing. It's a lot easier to write about it. So that's why I think we should, as scientists, we should start thinking about communicating science outside of the ivory tower, and in doing so, developing new partnerships between scientists and society. And I think that's what we need. And we just saw in the pandemic what happens if you don't have something like that. So I think that science communication is the key, not only to making science more diverse and inclusive, but just to get everyone on board with science, because science isn't inherently good or bad. It's just a way of learning new things about the world.
Sheeva, thank you so much. And those will be the last words of the episode. Such a wonderful perspective and tour of the intersection of science and policy, really digging down into the details from your own personal experience, your own passion for both science and communications, which we both agree is so rare in one human brain. So it's appropriate that you're a neuroscience scientist. Sheeva Azma, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure being on this excellent podcast and talking about science, policy, communications, and the links between all of them.
And listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.